Background.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is the Gold Coast of Australia.
I don't know. I've been to Central Coast, Australia.
I've never been to Australia, but definitely on the list of things to do.
Wonderful.
All right, so I am excited. I appreciate your question from last week about trying to make a concrete example of my theory. And as I wrestled with it, I ended up in a really interesting place. So maybe we can jump right into that.
Let's do that.
Share my screen here. And so we talked about global warming, and I thought that might be a little bit much to try and capture completely. So I decided to start with something simpler, gerbil warming. And so I came up with are your kids into Dr. Seuss, or were they when they were younger?
What do you mean?
Dr. Seuss, the children's author?
Oh, not aware.
You've never heard of Dr. Seuss? Okay, maybe it's an American or English language thing. So Dr. Seuss is like the Shakespeare of children's literature. He had a prodigious output, and there have been many movies made of his work. The Lorax was the one a few years ago, which was quite popular. And the Lorax was an environmentalist, and he spoke for the trees. So, okay, yes, these I'll have to include links to the cultural reference here to make sense. But anyway, the characters, two of his most memorable characters, one is the Lorax who spoke for the trees. The other is Horton the elephant, who is famous for, on the one hand, sitting on an egg and hatching it, and also listening to these small people called who's, who lived on a dust speck. And you hear these people living in a dust speck, and no one else thought they were real, and everyone thought he was crazy, and they did all sorts of horrible things to him because of it. Anyway, when I was thinking about, as I said, I didn't want to do global warming, so I thought I would do gerbil warming as a simpler, less emotionally charged issue. And also because if you're not claiming you're solving a real problem, you can just focus on a toy problem and let people draw their own conclusions how it applies to the real problem. But the Lorax is the one who's concerned about the environment, whereas Horton the elephant is really focused about being faithful. And so I chose them as my protagonists in this story, or antagonists if you prefer. And I simplified the problem to the gerbil is the basis of their economy. The hair of the gerbulous gerbil, Dr. Seuss is very familiar with it makes a lot of silly, fun names to say and read to kids. So the gerbulous gerbil makes hair, and then the who's, who live in the land of Seuss, use this hair to make seats and shoes, and that is their entire basis of their economy. And then, so the gerbil is overheating, apparently. Well, the gerbil is losing hair, and then there's a big argument about whether it's losing hair and why it's losing hair. And so the Lorax claims that the gerbil is overheating, and therefore he needs to diet and exercise in order to lose weight because he's too fat. That's the real problem. Horton the elephant doesn't think that the hair loss is real, but it might be, and if it is though, it's due to stress. And so the gerbil just needs to rest more. And so this would be an intellectual argument, except for the fact that the Lorax runs a company that makes running shoes, while Horton Elephant founded one that makes seats. And so that's the interesting conflict and tension. So that's kind of the way I framed the problem, is to have these polar discussions. I mean, the way I solved the problem is where it got really interesting here. In that I was trying to figure out, okay, how do I explain this? So my first thought was, well, I could go with the idea of a narrative, right? Which is the common way you make an argument and you introduce characters and get people to care about them. The challenge is, one, it's really tedious to come up with a really good story. But the second problem is when you tell a story, you're always telling it to make a point. And so you construct the story with the end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of begs the question if you're when you're doing it that way. And third, stories are hard to edit, right? You can't change one piece without changing the fundamental. You have to rewrite the whole story every time you change one piece. And so the goal of doing this was trying to create up with what we call the humanific revolution, right? Trying to come up with a scientific approach to these problems of human flourishing that people have argued about for thousands of years. And one of the phrases that I've been, was really struck by is someone, I forget who, said that humanity advances when we invent new methods for resolving arguments. So trial by jury, democratic election, GitHub pull requests, the scientific method, right? So that when, when people disagree and have a conflict, how do we resolve it? Like, for example, one of the great innovations of Rome is that they trained young noblemen to win, to resolve conflict by arguing in court. And that led to the trivium and, based on the Greek academies. And, it helped them build an empire where people resolve things in the courts instead of just beating each other up in the streets.
Right.
Now, it also saddled us with this huge legacy of the trivium to this day, where people obsess over things like rhetoric and logical fallacies, even at the point of diminishing returns or negative returns. But it was still an impressive achievement. And so, and when I started thinking about this, how do I encode an argument? It occurred to me, well, actually, I should just encode it in code. And this is a topic that I thought about, which I hadn't really looked into for a while, but I fantasized about this idea of computational philosophy. Whereas someone wants to define philosophy as trying to understand reality using natural language. And as you and I both know, natural language is a beautiful and horribly imprecise tool. And for fun, I listen to philosophy podcasts because I don't have the patience to actually read philosophical works. And it's both illuminating and infuriating, listening to people talk about things. Look, I think this word means this. Well, I think it means this. And you spend all your time trying to figure out what people actually mean, and very little trying to understand if they're actually right. And almost no time trying to figure out, well, how would you fix it to make it right? So one of the things I thought about for a while is that if we actually had a concise language for encoding philosophical arguments, we could actually make progress. Mm-hmm. And so this is sort of my first draft at doing that. And this is a language, it's not even a language, it's a computational data format, which is a whole nother story. But it's a way of encoding a set of assumptions in a relatively simple, easy to parse language that can also be executed. And so we create a population in the land of Seuss, which has the gerbil, Horton, Lorax, and 24 who's. And then we define these concepts we discussed from the IPA theory. We have different kinds of resources, we have different values and different capabilities. Is this relatively easy for you to scan and parse and understand what I'm doing here?
Yeah, to some degree, like referring back to my knowledge about computer science and early introduction to the programming languages and later to the C and C++ as object-oriented programming. So yes, yeah. I can follow to some degree.
Yeah, and the real syntax factor is that things with a dot are like a symbol, which is what you use to define things. And then when you use it without the dot, it's the value of the object. So you use that to execute it. And everything can be either a noun or a verb, depending on the context. So we define a bunch of names here, basically. And then brackets mean like type or predicate. And so the who's can have the type of being a Hortian or a Loroid, follower of Horton the elephant or of the Lorax. And so the idea is that we talked about the idea of status games or resource games. And so the idea is that the Hortian game is they make Arbucks. They gain resources based on the populations, how much they value rest, their own personal capability of making seats, and the amount of hair produced by the gerbil. And this is probably not the easiest to read thing, but it was the easiest for me to think about when I was creating it. Lorax played the analogous game with shoes, but they make more money when the society values exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the fundamental tension between their business models. And that's the way to encode that here. But they're all dependent on, obviously, the hair, because that's the raw material they use. And so over time, if there's less hair, they all make less money. But in the short term, it's based on this factor over here. And so this just means multiplied by roughly or something like that. So that's a way to encode that tension. And then the other thing I noticed is that, and this is getting into the world of liberal versus conservative, is that conservatives place a high value on being conservative, and liberals place a really high value on not being conservative. There's an interesting asymmetry there, but even at least in this world, there's this property called Hortonsy, which is a positive status thing for the Hortons and a negative status thing for the Loroids. And I think that was one of the things. We'll get into the application later, but so this is an example of a opposite or antithetical status games, where they are, status in one group what gains you status in one group loses you status in another group. Mm-hmm. And then this is an interesting one, which is an asymmetric status game. Like for being a Hortian, they really focus on productivity, and so they invest a lot of status in getting good at making seats. And they have a lot of pride in that, and they go to workshops on this, and they get degrees in this, and they're really obsessed around this. Whereas Lorides, they really gain status by showing how much they love the gerbil. That is their status game that they play a lot. And so they're always confused why the Hortians are so obsessed over the seat, and the Hortians are confused why the Lorides are so obsessed about the gerbil. Mm-hmm. And this ties into being Hortonsy also in interesting ways. And the other thing that people don't talk about nearly as much is that everyone gets status from having resources, right? So Arbucks is a useful resource for, buying food and things like that, but it's also a source of status in its own right. And that's a factor in there. Now, being generous, I'm assuming that the Horton and the Lorax are actually not capitalists. They're dollar a year guys, right? They just run these companies because they believe in them, not because they're trying to get rich. But they do gain status based on how many followers they have, right? And so they playing the status game implicitly and possibly even subconsciously of where their status is tied to their number of followers. So anything that attracts followers increases their status, anything that detracts followers decreases their status. So this is a way of encoding these assumptions about the psychology and the incentives of this environment. And then the idea is that you can run different scenarios. And, so there's one scenario where the hair is driven by the amount of exercise. Another scenario is driven by the amount of rest. And just for fun, I threw in a latency parameter, because that's usually what makes these things so horrifically painful is latencies, right? As we've learned that a latency of about 2 weeks seems to be right at the threshold of human behavioral recognition, right? Just looking around the world, you'll see that countries, or even in the US, we can see counties where they responded to coronavirus, with low latency, did much better than counties and states that didn't respond. And we can actually understand this and look at and understand cause and effect at that latency level, sort of just barely, which is interesting. And so the idea is, the reason why this is interesting to me is that it makes our intuitions and our assumptions explicit, right? And so going back to your original 8 tools that we discussed a couple of episodes ago, you mentioned like the easiest way to try and spread a behavior in a population is to pick the people who are green, who already practice that behavior and increase their status, make them role models for people so that the people who are yellow and on the fence would be encouraged to become more green. At least that's how I interpreted your tool about the overlapping circles. I forget which number that was.
That's number 4. And let me just add a little bit of precision here.
Sure.
It's about green people, and green people are those that are presently already having the behavior and explicitly doing the behavior. And it doesn't require them to become any way as a role models, except that their everyday activity is a great data input to be exposed or to be used as the content for the feedback loop towards the green, towards the yellow people. So that's
how is that any different than being a role model? Because it's basically saying, look at these people doing X, you should be doing X. I mean, that is almost the definition of a role model, unless I'm missing something.
And again, we can come back to your previous description, how the people were philosophically discussing terms. And again, we can have like different perspective on the term, what the role model is. But
So can we use the word exemplar? Is that a good neutral term? Examples of how to do it right.
Yeah, it's enough to say exemplary, yes, exemplary positive behaviors. And then it's just the amount and the frequencies that we would be able to observe. Yes, just to finish up with the role models, I don't know for what reason, but in my head, it just is always associated with a personality that becomes a model for a certain role that they express as endorsers. But yes, let's not go into the discussing the terminology. We can just quickly discuss and figure out maybe more appropriate or more precise.
So, and let me be slightly more generous in that. So I think and this is actually the philosophical distinction or assertion perhaps, is that, if you approach this from an information theoretic perspective, you could say that, hey, I'm just using this as an information base to help population yellow understand a behavior. And if they just examine population green, then they will gain information that will allow them to emulate this behavior, right? That is one way of looking at the situation.
Let's again be more precise. It's not about getting the information in a sense of how we usually perceive information, but that would be about the behavioral exposure. So yes, yellow would be able to observe the exposure of the frequencies and different other parameters of those positive behaviors done by the green people on an instant basis. Yes.
Right. So the interesting thing to me is that I forget what the name of the effect is, but like when you observe people doing a behavior, they will naturally tend to do the behavior that will increase the amount of approval you get from them, right? So like observing workers work will make them more productive, right? Just the act of observation, right? There's a quantum thing in here. And the other thing is that, as you know with small children, any attention you show to one will be either copied or resented by the other siblings, right? You have two children?
Yes.
Right, and that's the interesting thing about this model, is that issues of status and attention are explicit and in fact dominant, right? You'll notice that of the games we're playing, like, even in just this one example, like 3/5 of them are around status rather than resources. Interestingly enough, right?
So just to give you a comment on the first that you said, that if people are observed and their performance changes, that goes under one of the 7 social influence principles, and it goes under social facilitation. So there are the two subdimensions. So people experience facilitation either or. or two together. So one is when they do actively together with others at the same time and place, which I explained, I think, in a few episodes ago. And the other one is that people tend to change their performance based on the spectators.
Mm-hmm.
So if there are spectators, then people tend to positively increase their performance for the known tasks. So if they know it well, so their performance goes up. And if there is a task that is not that familiar and people are asked to do it, then the effect of the spectator would actually make them more performing less accurate or less precise, because, I don't know, it kicks in some kind of effect of self criticizing or whatever it is. I'm just making this up, but that's the effects that have been studied already for 100 years.
Right. Okay. So let me actually step back, and let me reframe it. The way that in this model, the way I would implement your theory about circles is by introducing a new status game, and so that increases the status of people who exercise.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And, you know, and I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but that's the way you would do it in this formalism, right? And what's interesting about that, you know, is if we could run the simulation, I suspect what would happen is that the Loroids would immediately start playing that status game. And I guess, you know, in my model, there's the status game, the base game of that, and then there's the meta game, because there would be an agent. Let's call it a Sneetch, another character there that introduces the status game. And that Sneetch would immediately gain status from the Loroids adopting it. And that would increase the exercise. And the Hortians would have an incentive, would lose status. And so I haven't figured out how to encode this particular feedback loop yet, but the idea is that you would see that there would be an incentive for Horton to declare exercise un-Hortonsy. And they would start a status game, a counter status game, or try to sabotage that status game. And in fact, that would be predictable from this model, that if you go with the simple intervention, which is increasing the status of the group that's already doing the behavior in a non-homogeneous or anti-homogeneous population, you would get a counter game that would end up, rather than getting the normal diffusion curve of the green to yellow slowly winning over the red, you would get this hollowing out of the middle, where the yellows become more green, but then the oranges become more red. And then people get locked into the status game where if they change their mind, they have to lose their group affiliation and their status and all these other things. And, you know, I haven't figured out the psychological mechanism of this. If I could, I'd probably make $1 million, which is that how we create these internal status loops. And so the hypothesis is that, you know, and whether this is the right encoding of this particular problem or even the right formalism, the idea is that if you are trying to work in a complex system rather than a simple system, which has positive and negative feedback loops, in a world where things like this were common, easily usable tools, then you would say, okay, this is what the organism, the society, population looks like now. Let's model it, the existing dynamics, and come up with a plausible scheme of describing, you know, the behaviors, the salient behaviors we see. And then we can simulate different interventions and see what would happen. And this is, of course, post-diction rather than prediction. It's like, maybe if we picked one side and really tried to get the early adopters on this, it would actually backfire because it would create this counter reaction. Maybe an interesting design pattern alternative that I saw once, another children's movie from a long time ago was called The Prince of Egypt. And this was a Hollywood blockbuster movie by DreamWorks based on the life of Moses, a biblical character. Now, I don't know if you know much about American cultural things, but Hollywood and people who read the Bible don't often get along very well. And so there's a bit of a cultural tension there. So what DreamWorks did is they got a bunch of faith-based leaders in this community that were highly respected and invited them in to be part of the process of screening the movie. And basically showered status upon them by listening to them, inviting them to parties, giving them private screenings and things like this. So when the movie came out, these leaders all said, hey, this is a great movie here, and you should really, and it was rather than going for the easy win and be an easy associations, they deliberately played sort of a preemptive status co-option game, which was a really interesting trick. And so the hope is that by surfacing and forcing people to be explicit about these issues and then giving people visualizations, right? One of the reasons for encoding this as a data format rather than a traditional language is that you can play with the parameters in the visual style, right? One of my bugbears is everyone obsesses over visual programming, but no one obsesses over the data format used to encode that visual programming. If you have the right data format, visualization is trivial. If you have the wrong data format, then your visualizations always break down somewhere very painfully. Just one of my favorite quotes is that every programming language is really a horrible document format, except for Lisp, which is a horrible data format. The idea is that if you have, and then there's another great software activist named Brett Victor. I don't know if he was in your circle of knowledge. He was really big about 10 years ago. And his thing was inventing on principle and visualizable programming. Like if you're building a game, why don't you have a tool that like runs the game in real time, and then when you pull a slider, it changes things like gravity and basically the thing is that it's kind of the same premise, is that right now we encode things in mathematical formalisms, and you have to be a really good visualizer to understand what those parameters mean. We have so much computational power, you should just embed all that knowledge in your tools. And so you can have people playing with these things interactively, but it's an editable view, is you can actually change the code in real time and see the result in the simulation. And right now, transformational interventions are horribly painful and expensive and incredibly noisy. And so the hypothesis, which I kind of came to in this process, is that this idea of computational philosophy is that if we had tools and platforms that made this like an everyday thing that was just sort of expected, like right now, if you're doing a project, it's expected you will give a pitch deck. It's expected you will give a budgetary cost breakdown. It's expected you will write an executive summary. That's just things you do as part of the pitching process when you're trying to do something in an organization. What if it was just expected that you would get a simulation, an editable simulation? And in fact, personal story, this was the thing that flipped my bits around COVID-19. Is a friend of mine who's a data scientist forwarded me an essay on Medium, which had a link to, he said, okay, this is why every day you delay in instituting a lockdown is going to cost your society or your community. And he goes, this is based on a model that I have created that is available as open source on GitHub, which makes certain assumptions about growth rate, infection rate, et cetera. And based on this data set that is here. And you can go in and play with this model for yourself. And if you disagree with me, fine, but tell me where you think my model is wrong, and then run the numbers yourself and see what you get. And it's like, I didn't actually do all that, like maybe very superficially. It's like, okay, but someone who is willing to do that and expose all their thinking and all their logic, that solves the status metagame. I don't care what axe this person has to grind, as long as they make all their assumptions explicit so I can check and test them. And anyone who's willing, and that meta signal of, I believe in the data more than I believe in winning the game, was what convinced me, that meta signal. And so that's the world I want to create, is one where people are, people who want to make a change in the world show their data. There's a line, I think it's I attributed to Michael Bloomberg, in God we trust, everyone else brings data.
Yeah, I would agree. Data is essential for research. And again, like seeing it holistically. It's not like academic research. Research is to make sense, and that sense has to be like a shared understanding of how we live. So therefore, yes, data is the way how we can test our hypothesis and actually do something about our observations. Yeah, that's like a basic scientific method. Data is always part of it, and also
right.
everything we do.
There's three pieces. I think there's data, there's modeling, and visualizations. And then they need to be all open, consumable, and editable by the communities affected.
That sounds great. Yes, I also work on the quantitative data models and building themselves. And it would be amazing to have a tool that would allow that model to be edited on the fly, and also different visualizations, how the data points are feeding the model, like heating it up, and actually how that model is responding. And then you maybe feed another data set on top of it, and then you see how it like heats up a part of the model, except compared to the whole thing. So yes, that would be a great world. By the way, thanks.
All right, so let's leave on that optimistic note, and then I guess we'll talk again on Friday and think about, maybe we can have this discussion. How would we get to such a world?
Yeah, why not? Let's do that. All right.
All right. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Have a great week, and I'll talk to you Friday.
All right. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.